The September sun blazed mercilessly over Redemption Creek, casting harsh shadows across the wooden planks of the makeshift altar erected in front of the town's largest saloon. White ribbons fluttered in the hot, dusty wind that swept down from the mesa, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant promise of a storm brewing on the horizon. Eleanor Whitmore stood rigid in her ivory silk gown, imported all the way from San Francisco at her father's insistence, feeling like a prize heifer being led to auction. The lace collar scratched against her neck as she watched Samuel Crowe approach the altar with his characteristic swagger. At 28, Crowe was a formidable man with calculating grey eyes and hands that had never known honest work. His black suit was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine, but Eleanor could see the predator lurking beneath the gentleman's facade. She'd heard the whispers about his methods of acquiring land, the mysterious fires, the intimidation, the families who simply vanished one night. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Hayes, his voice carrying over the crowd of nearly 200 guests. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Eleanor Whitmore and Samuel Crowe." Eleanor's emerald eyes swept desperately over the assembled crowd. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, stood proud and satisfied near the front, his silver mustache waxed to perfection. At 55, he commanded respect throughout the territory, his cattle empire stretching from the Colorado border to the Rio Grande. But today, Eleanor saw him as her betrayer, the man who had sold her future for 30,000 acres of prime grazing land. The Reverend's words became a distant drone as panic clawed at Eleanor's chest. She couldn't do this. She couldn't spend her life as Samuel Crowe's possession, bearing his children while he expanded his empire through fear and violence. Her hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet of desert wildflowers, their petals already wilting in the oppressive heat. "If anyone has just cause why these two should not be joined in matrimony," Reverend Hayes intoned, "speak now or forever hold your peace." The silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized this was her last chance. In desperation, her gaze fell upon a figure lurking at the edge of the crowd, a beggar in tattered clothes, his face partially hidden beneath a worn hat pulled low. Dust covered his patched shirt and worn boots, and stubble darkened his lean jaw. He looked to be around her age, maybe 25, with calloused hands that spoke of hard labor. Without thinking, Eleanor broke from the altar and pushed through the startled crowd. Gasps and murmurs erupted as she reached the mysterious stranger. His eyes, a striking blue beneath dark brows, widened in surprise as she grabbed his shoulders. "I'm sorry," she whispered desperately, "but I need you to be my salvation." Before he could respond, Eleanor pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was equal parts desperation and defiance. The crowd erupted in shocked cries and angry shouts, but for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. His lips were warm and surprisingly gentle, and she felt something unexpected spark between them, something that had nothing to do with her desperate ploy. When she pulled away, his blue eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something familiar in his gaze, something that stirred a memory she couldn't quite grasp. "This man," Eleanor declared, turning to face the stunned gathering while keeping one hand on the stranger's arm, "this man is my true love. I cannot marry Samuel Crowe when my heart belongs to another." The beggar, Jake Sullivan, though she didn't know his name yet, stared at her in amazement. He had come to this wedding with one purpose: to scout the Whitmore ranch for weaknesses, to find a way to reclaim what Thomas Whitmore had stolen from his family 15 years ago. The last thing he'd expected was to be pulled into the drama by the very woman whose father had destroyed his life. Samuel Crowe's face turned purple with rage. "This is preposterous," he bellowed, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt .45 at his hip. "Thomas, control your daughter!" But Thomas Whitmore looked as stunned as everyone else, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The careful political alliance he'd orchestrated was crumbling before his eyes. "Eleanor," he finally managed, his voice sharp with authority, "what is the meaning of this?" "I won't be sold like cattle, father," Eleanor replied, her chin raised defiantly, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I choose love over money." Jake felt the weight of every eye upon them. He could walk away now, disappear into the crowd, and leave Eleanor to face the consequences of her impulsive act. But something in her desperate courage stirred something long buried in his chest, and perhaps, just perhaps, this unexpected turn could serve his own purposes. "That's right," he said quietly, his voice carrying a subtle authority that made several people in the crowd look at him more closely. Eleanor and I have been meeting in secret. We're in love." The lie rolled off his tongue with surprising ease, but as he looked into Eleanor's grateful green eyes, he wondered if it might not become something more. The silence that followed Jake's declaration lasted only heartbeats before chaos erupted. Samuel Crowe's hand flew to his gun, but Thomas Whitmore stepped between him and the couple, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Now see here, Samuel," Thomas said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Let me handle my daughter." "Handle her?" Crowe snarled, his grey eyes blazing. "She's made fools of us all. I want satisfaction, Thomas, from her and this vagrant she's chosen over me." Jake felt Eleanor's grip tighten on his arm. Even through the worn fabric of his shirt, he could feel her trembling. She was terrified, but trying desperately to appear brave. Something about her courage in the face of such overwhelming odds stirred an unexpected protectiveness in him. "What's your name, boy?" Thomas Whitmore demanded, stepping closer to Jake. At this distance, Jake could see the steel in the older man's brown eyes, the same ruthless determination that had driven him to destroy the Sullivan Ranch all those years ago. "Jake," he replied simply, meeting Thomas's gaze without flinching. "Jake Smith." Thomas's voice dripped with skepticism. "And where exactly did you and my daughter conduct this supposed courtship? She's been under my roof every night for months." Eleanor's mind raced. She had to make this believable, or they were both dead. "At the creek," she said quickly. "When I rode out to check the fence lines, we met by accident when his horse threw a shoe near the old cottonwood." Jake nodded, improvising along with her. "I was passing through looking for work. Eleanor showed me kindness when others wouldn't even look at me." "Lies," Crowe exploded. "All lies. Thomas, you know as well as I do that this girl is trying to wriggle out of our agreement. I paid good money for—" "Paid?" Eleanor's voice cut through Crowe's words like a blade. The entire crowd heard her, and a murmur rippled through the gathering. "You paid for me? Like a horse or a head of cattle?" Thomas's face went red. "Eleanor, that's not—" "How much?" she demanded, her voice rising. "How much am I worth to you, Father? 30,000 acres, 40. What was the price of your daughter's happiness?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several women nodded in sympathy while the men looked away. Everyone knew marriage was often about business on the frontier, but Eleanor's public humiliation of her father was making everyone uncomfortable. Jake saw his opportunity. "She's not property," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "Eleanor's a woman with her own mind, her own heart. If she doesn't want to marry Crowe, that should be the end of it." "The end of it?" Crowe's laugh was harsh and bitter. "I don't think so, Smith. You've cost me a lot of money today, and I intend to collect." His hand moved again toward his gun. "Samuel," Thomas's voice held a warning. "Not here, not in front of everyone." But Jake could see the violence brewing in Crowe's eyes. The man wasn't going to let this insult stand, witnesses or no witnesses. And Eleanor, still clinging to his arm in her beautiful wedding dress, would be caught in the crossfire. "Eleanor," Jake murmured, leaning close to her ear. "Can you ride?" "Of course," she whispered back, confused. "Then when I give the word, run for those horses behind the church, the bay mare. She looks fast." Eleanor's eyes widened as she understood his intention. "But I can't just—" "Eleanor Whitmore," Thomas's voice boomed across the square. "You will come home with me right now, and we will discuss this privately. As for you, Smith, you'll get out of Redemption Creek while you still can." "I'm not going anywhere without Eleanor," Jake said firmly. "Like hell you're not." Crowe's gun cleared leather with practiced speed, but Jake was already moving. He shoved Eleanor aside and dove for cover behind a nearby wagon as the Colt .45 barked twice. "Run!" Jake shouted to Eleanor as he rolled behind the wagon's wheel. "Now!" Eleanor hiked up her silk skirts and ran, her heart pounding as bullets whined overhead. Behind her, she could hear men shouting and more gunfire erupting. Jake appeared beside her as she reached the horses, his face grim. "Can you ride in that dress?" he asked urgently, already untying the bay mare's reins. "Watch me," Eleanor gasped, grabbing the saddle horn and swinging up despite the restrictive gown. The silk tore with a loud rip, but she managed to get astride. Jake vaulted onto a sorrel gelding just as Crowe and 3 of his men rounded the corner of the church, guns drawn. "This way!" Jake shouted, spurring his horse toward the open desert. They thundered out of town with bullets singing past their ears, Eleanor's wedding veil streaming behind her like a white banner of rebellion. As they reached the safety of a rocky outcropping a mile from town, Jake finally allowed himself to look back. A dust cloud marked the pursuit already beginning. "They'll follow us," Eleanor panted, her face flushed with exertion and excitement. "I know," Jake replied grimly. "Eleanor, what have you gotten us into?" She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since their desperate flight began. Even covered in dust and sweat, there was something compelling about him, something that made her trust him despite knowing nothing about who he really was. "I don't know," she admitted, "but whatever happens next, it has to be better than marrying Samuel Crowe." Jake studied her determined face and felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't part of his plan for revenge against Thomas Whitmore, but maybe fate had handed him something better than he'd dared hope for. "Then we'd better keep riding," he said. "Because they're coming and they're not planning to talk." The desert stretched endlessly before them, a rolling landscape of red rock and scattered mesquite that shimmered in the afternoon heat. Eleanor's torn wedding dress clung to her legs as she urged the bay mare forward, following Jake deeper into the wasteland. Behind them, the dust cloud of their pursuers had grown larger, more ominous. "There!" Jake pointed toward a narrow canyon cutting through the sandstone cliffs ahead. "We can lose them in there." Eleanor nodded, too breathless to speak. Her carefully pinned hair had come loose, auburn strands whipping around her face as they rode. She'd never ridden this hard in her life, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. They plunged into the canyon's cool shadows, their horses' hooves echoing off the narrow walls. Jake led the way with sure confidence, navigating twists and turns as if he'd traveled this route many times before. Eleanor wondered how a drifting beggar would know these hidden paths so well, but there was no time for questions. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Jake pulled up in a small clearing where a spring bubbled from the rocks, creating a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees. "We'll rest the horses here," he said, dismounting quickly. Eleanor slid from her saddle, her legs shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. The reality of what she'd done was beginning to sink in. She'd abandoned her father, her home, her entire life for a complete stranger, a man whose last name she didn't even know. "Jake," she began, then stopped as she watched him examine her horse with practiced hands, checking hooves and breathing. These weren't the movements of a vagrant. They were the actions of someone who knew horses intimately, someone raised around them. "She's sound," Jake said, patting the mare's neck. "Good choice. This is one of your father's best mounts." "How would you know that?" Eleanor asked suspiciously. Jake froze, realizing his mistake. He'd been so focused on their escape that he'd let his guard down. I've seen her before. Around town." "No," Eleanor said, stepping closer to him. "You've never been to Redemption Creek before today. I would have remembered you, and you know these canyons like you've ridden them your whole life. Who are you really?" Before Jake could answer, the sound of horses echoing through the canyon made them both freeze. Their pursuers had found the entrance. "This way," Jake whispered urgently, grabbing Eleanor's hand and pulling her toward a narrow crack in the canyon wall barely wide enough for a person. Quietly, they squeezed through the opening, leading their horses into a hidden chamber that opened up beyond. Eleanor gasped as she saw what lay before them. The ruins of an old ranch burned out and overgrown with desert scrub. A chimney stood like a lonely sentinel among the blackened foundation stones, and a few corrals remained, their wooden rails weathered silver-gray by years of sun and wind. "What is this place?" Eleanor whispered. Jake's jaw tightened as he looked at the ruins. Coming here hadn't been part of his plan, but they'd needed somewhere to hide. Now surrounded by the ghosts of his past, he felt the old anger rising in his chest. "This was the Sullivan Ranch," he said quietly, "or what's left of it." Eleanor frowned. The name was familiar, but she couldn't place it immediately. "Sullivan? I've heard that name before." "You should have. Your father burned it to the ground 15 years ago." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She stared at Jake, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. "You're not Jake Smith." "No," he said, turning to face her fully. "I'm Jake Sullivan. My family owned this land before your father decided he wanted it for himself." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Now she remembered the stories whispered in town, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. A family that had opposed Thomas Whitmore's expansion, who had refused to sell their land. A mysterious fire that had killed Jake Sullivan's parents and destroyed everything they'd built. "The fire," she whispered. "Father said it was an accident, lightning during a storm." Jake's laugh was bitter. "Lightning doesn't leave behind the smell of kerosene, Eleanor, and it doesn't happen on the same night your father's men were seen riding in this direction." "No," Eleanor shook her head, backing away from him. "Father wouldn't. He's not a murderer." "Isn't he?" Jake moved toward her, his blue eyes blazing with 15 years of suppressed rage. My parents died in that fire, Eleanor. I was 22, away breaking horses for a rancher in Colorado. I came home to find nothing but ashes and my family in the ground. Eleanor felt sick. She leaned against the stone wall for support, her mind reeling. If this is true, if Father really did this, now why didn't you go to the law? With what proof? Your father owned half the territorial judges by then. I was just a kid with a grudge and no evidence, except the smell of kerosene that had faded by morning. Jake's voice was rough with old pain. I've spent 15 years planning how to get back what was stolen from me, and I'm part of that plan. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. You didn't just happen to be at that wedding. You were there because of Father. Jake couldn't meet her eyes. I was gathering information, looking for weaknesses in his operation. So when I kissed you, when I begged you to be my salvation, Eleanor's voice broke. It was all just convenient for your revenge. Eleanor, no. It started that way, but nothing. She whirled away from him, angry tears streaming down her face. I'm such a fool. I thought you were different, that you actually cared about helping me, but I'm just another tool in your war against my father. That's not true anymore, Jake said desperately. Eleanor, please listen to me. The sound of voices echoing from the main canyon cut him off. Crowe's men had found their hiding place. Well, well, came Samuel Crowe's voice, cold and mocking. Look what we have here, the lost Sullivan spread. How fitting that you'd bring her here, boy. Jake cursed under his breath and drew the Colt 45 he'd taken from his saddlebags. Eleanor stared at him in shock. Where had a beggar gotten such a fine weapon? Stay behind me, Jake whispered to Eleanor, but she shook her head. Why should I trust you now? Maybe I should just walk out there and tell them the truth. Because whatever you think of me now, Jake said urgently, Crowe will kill us both rather than let this story get out. Your father's secret dies with us if we don't fight. Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw not just the anger and pain of the past, but genuine fear for her. Despite everything, despite the lies and the deception, Jake Sullivan was still trying to protect her. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the canyon walls, and Eleanor made her choice. Eleanor pressed herself against the stone wall beside Jake, her heart hammering as Crowe's voice grew closer. Despite her anger and hurt, she found herself reaching for the small derringer hidden in her boot, a wedding gift from her father that she'd never expected to use. 6 shots, Jake whispered, checking his revolver. How many men does Crowe have with him? At least 4 that I saw, Eleanor replied quietly, surprised by her own steadiness. Maybe more. Jake nodded grimly. Not good odds, but he'd faced worse. Eleanor, there's something else you need to know. About your father and what really happened here. Now? You want to tell me more lies now? Not lies. The truth you deserve to hear. Jake's eyes never left the canyon entrance, but his voice was urgent. My parents didn't just refuse to sell. They discovered something on this land that your father wanted buried forever. Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, Crowe's voice boomed through the hidden chamber. Come out, Sullivan. Yes, I know who you are. Been waiting 15 years for you to show your face again. Jake's blood ran cold. You knew? Of course I knew. Crowe laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls. You think you could drift around the territory asking questions about the Whitmore ranch without word getting back to me? I've been tracking you for months. Eleanor stared at Jake in shock. Months? You've been planning this for months? I had to be sure, Jake said desperately. I had to have proof before you what? Crowe's voice was closer now. Before you told the world that Thomas Whitmore is a murderer, that he burned out your family to cover up the silver mine they found on Sullivan land? Eleanor's gasp was audible. Silver mine? Oh yes, sweetheart, Crowe continued mockingly. Your dear father has been pulling ore out of these hills for 15 years, made him rich enough to buy half the territorial government. The Sullivan ranch was just in the way. Jake closed his eyes, the final piece of his revenge falling into place. He'd suspected there was more to his parents' death than just land greed, but hearing Crowe confirm it brought back all the rage and grief he'd carried for so long. So, you see, Crowe's voice was getting dangerously close, this has all worked out rather nicely. I get to eliminate the last Sullivan, claim my bride, and keep Thomas Whitmore's secret safe. 3 birds, 1 stone. Eleanor looked at Jake with new understanding. The proof you mentioned, you found it. Jake nodded, pulling a leather pouch from inside his shirt. Assay reports, correspondence between your father and territorial officials, payment records for the men who set the fire, everything. Including, Crowe's voice came from just outside their hiding place, Letters from your parents to the territorial governor, threatening to expose Whitmore's illegal mining operation. A shadow fell across the entrance to their hideout. Eleanor raised her derringer with trembling hands as Crowe appeared, flanked by 3 armed men. His usually immaculate appearance was dusty and disheveled, but his grey eyes held the cold satisfaction of a hunter closing in on wounded prey. "Drop the guns," Crowe commanded. "Both of you." Jake hesitated, then slowly placed his Colt on the ground. Eleanor kept her derringer trained on Crowe, though her hands shook. "The little lady thinks she's going to shoot me?" Crowe smiled coldly. "Eleanor, sweetheart, you're about to become a very rich widow. Your father's already signed the papers transferring his holdings to me upon your marriage. Dead or alive, you're still my wife in the eyes of the law." "I'll never be your wife," Eleanor spat. "Oh, but you already are, remember? The ceremony was completed before you ran off with your beggar friend here. In the eyes of the church and the law, we're married." Eleanor's blood ran cold as she realized he was right. She'd been so focused on stopping the ceremony that she hadn't considered the legal ramifications. In frontier law, an interrupted ceremony could still be considered binding if both parties had agreed beforehand. "Which means," Crowe continued, "that when Sullivan here shoots you in a jealous rage before I heroically gun him down, I'll inherit everything. The Whitmore ranch, the silver mine, everything." "You're insane," Jake said, but he was calculating distances, looking for any advantage. "I'm practical," Crowe replied. "Eleanor, say goodbye to your lover." Eleanor saw Crowe's gun swinging toward Jake and acted on pure instinct. Her derringer barked twice, catching one of Crowe's men in the shoulder and spinning him around. In the same instant, Jake dove for his dropped Colt, rolling as bullets chipped stone where he'd been standing. The narrow chamber erupted in gunfire and chaos. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall as Jake traded shots with Crowe's remaining men. Through the smoke and noise, she saw Crowe advancing on her, his face twisted with rage. "You little hellcat," he snarled, raising his gun. "I should have beaten the spirit out of you from the start." Eleanor's derringer was empty, but she wasn't defenseless. Years of frontier life had taught her that survival sometimes meant fighting dirty. As Crowe reached for her, she grabbed a handful of sand and threw it in his eyes, then brought her knee up hard. Crowe doubled over with a grunt of pain, and Eleanor scrambled toward where Jake was still fighting. She saw him take down the last of Crowe's men, but the effort left him exposed. Crowe, half-blinded and furious, was raising his gun again. "Jake!" Eleanor screamed. Jake spun, but he was too far away, too slow. Eleanor saw death in Crowe's eyes as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. Without thinking, she threw herself between them. The gunshot seemed to echo forever in the confined space. Eleanor felt the bullet tear through her shoulder, spinning her around. She hit the stone wall hard and slid to the ground, her vision graying at the edges. Through the haze of pain, she heard Jake roar with rage. There was another gunshot, then silence. "Eleanor!" Jake's voice seemed to come from very far away. She felt strong hands lifting her, cradling her against a broad chest. "Eleanor, stay with me." She opened her eyes to find Jake's face inches from hers, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "Crowe," she whispered. "Dead," Jake said grimly. "They're all dead. Eleanor, why did you do that? Why did you save me?" Eleanor managed a weak smile despite the fire burning in her shoulder. "Because despite everything you've done, despite all the lies, I think I'm falling in love with you, Jake Sullivan." Jake stared down at her, his carefully constructed plans for revenge crumbling in the face of her courage and sacrifice. "Eleanor, the truth," she whispered. "No more lies. Do you care about me at all, or am I just part of your war against my father?" Jake looked into her green eyes and saw his future written there, not the future of vengeance he'd planned, but something better, something worth abandoning his quest for revenge. "I love you," he said simply. "God help me, Eleanor. I love you more than I hate your father." As Eleanor smiled and closed her eyes, Jake held her close and wondered if love could truly conquer the blood debt between their families. 3 days later, Eleanor woke in the soft bed of Doc Martinez's clinic in Redemption Creek, her shoulder bound tightly, but the fever finally broken. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, and she could hear the familiar sounds of the town going about its business outside. For a moment, she wondered if everything had been a dream, the wedding, the escape, the shootout in the canyon. Then she saw Jake sitting in a chair beside her bed, his hat in his hands and his face etched with worry and exhaustion. He'd cleaned up, shaved, and changed into proper clothes, but his blue eyes held the same intensity she remembered from their desperate flight. "You're awake," he said softly, relief flooding his voice. Doc Martinez wasn't sure. The fever was so high. How long? Eleanor's voice was hoarse from days of delirium. 3 days. I brought you straight here after... Jake's jaw tightened. After Crowe and his men were dead. Your father's been here every day, Eleanor. He's been out of his mind with worry. Eleanor tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. Father's here. Jake, you need to leave before he sees you. If he knows who you really are... He knows, Jake interrupted. I told him everything. Eleanor stared at him in shock. You what? I gave him the documents, Eleanor. All the proof I'd gathered about the silver mine, the payoffs, the murder of my parents, everything. Are you insane? Eleanor struggled to sit up despite the pain. He'll have you hanged. No, came Thomas Whitmore's voice from the doorway. He won't. Eleanor turned to see her father enter the room, his face haggard and aged beyond his 55 years. His usually perfect mustache was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them. Behind him stood Sheriff Morrison, a fair man Eleanor had known since childhood. Father, Eleanor began, but Thomas held up his hand. Eleanor, let me speak first. I have a lot to answer for. Thomas approached slowly, his eyes moving between his daughter and Jake. Mr. Sullivan has shown me documents that prove everything he's accused me of. The silver mine, the payoffs to territorial officials, and yes, the fire that killed his parents. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. Despite everything, hearing her father confirm Jake's accusations was like a knife to her heart. I want you to know, Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly, that I never intended for anyone to die. I hired men to intimidate the Sullivans, to pressure them into selling. The fire was supposed to be a warning, burn down their barn, maybe their fences. But the wind shifted, and... He stopped, unable to continue. And my parents died screaming, Jake finished, his voice hard as granite. Thomas flinched as if struck. Yes, and I've lived with that guilt every day since. I used the money from the silver to build my empire, thinking I could somehow justify their deaths by creating something lasting, but all I created was more suffering. Eleanor reached out weakly and took Jake's hand. What happens now? Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. Your father has confessed to his crimes, Miss Whitmore. He's signed a full statement detailing his involvement in the illegal mining operation and the events leading to the Sullivan family's death. But, Thomas interrupted, I've also taken steps to make amends. He turned to Jake with weary eyes. The Sullivan Ranch is yours again, Mr. Sullivan. I've signed over the deed plus 40,000 acres of prime grazing land as compensation. The silver mine's profits for the past 15 years, every penny, will be transferred to you as well. Jake stared at the older man in amazement. Why? Why are you doing this? Thomas looked at his daughter, pale and wounded in the hospital bed. Because my girl nearly died protecting you. Because she loves you, and despite everything I've done, I love her. And because... He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Because it's the right thing to do. 15 years too late, but right nonetheless. What about the law? Eleanor asked. Father, you've confessed to murder. The territorial judge will hear the case next month, Sheriff Morrison said. Given Mr. Whitmore's cooperation and restitution, he'll likely receive a prison sentence rather than hanging. Maybe 5 years, possibly less with good behavior. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. 5 years seemed both too much and too little for what her father had done. There's one more thing, Thomas said, pulling a folded document from his jacket. Annulment papers for your marriage to Samuel Crowe. I've had 3 lawyers confirm that since you never spoke your vows willingly and the ceremony was interrupted by violence, the union was never legally binding. Relief flooded through Eleanor. She was free, truly free for the first time in her life. Thomas turned to Jake. I know you have every right to hate me, Mr. Sullivan. If you want me to hang for what I did to your family, I'll understand. Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the broken man who had destroyed his life, and now offered everything in return. The rage that had sustained him for 15 years was still there, but it was overshadowed by something else. The love he felt for the woman holding his hand, and perhaps the beginning of forgiveness. I don't want revenge anymore, Mr. Whitmore, Jake said finally. I want justice, and you're providing that. But more than anything, I want your daughter to be happy. Can you accept that she'll be happy with me? Thomas looked at Eleanor, seeing the love shining in her eyes as she gazed at Jake. If Eleanor chooses you, then you have my blessing. After everything I've put her through, her happiness is all that matters to me now. 2 months later, Eleanor stood on the porch of the rebuilt Sullivan ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and red. Her shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar as a reminder of that terrible day in the canyon. Behind her, she could hear Jake moving around in the kitchen, preparing breakfast before heading out to check on the cattle. They'd been married 3 weeks ago in a simple ceremony in the little church at Redemption Creek, with only Doc Martinez and Sheriff Morrison as witnesses. Thomas had been in the territorial prison by then, but he'd sent his blessing through a letter that still sat on Eleanor's dressing table. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," Jake said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Beautiful day." "It is," Eleanor agreed, leaning back against his chest. "Jake, do you ever regret it? Giving up your revenge for this?" Jake considered the question seriously, as he always did. "I got something better than revenge, Eleanor. I got justice and I got you. My parents would approve of the choice I made." Eleanor turned in his arms and kissed him softly. "I love you, Jake Sullivan." "I love you too, Eleanor Sullivan," he replied, and in his voice she heard not the bitter anger of the man who'd infiltrated her wedding, but the contentment of a man who'd found his home at last. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song across the rangeland that belonged to the Sullivans once again. The past couldn't be changed, but the future stretched before them bright with promise, a future built not on vengeance or greed, but on love and the courage to choose forgiveness over hate. As they stood together watching the sun rise over their land, Eleanor knew they had both found their redemption in each other, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquering enemies, but from healing old wounds and building something beautiful from the ashes of the past.